Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly a deeply turbulent era in history. When we look back at the 19th century in America, it's basically this giant cauldron of massive cultural and social shifts. And it begs the question, how do institutions even survive when the very fabric of their society is just being torn apart? Well, for American Christian institutions, this whole period was defined by two monumental upheavals. We're talking about two completely distinct, incredibly challenging battles that literally shape the future of both the nation and the church. So we are going to explore exactly how these institutions navigated survival, their own identity, and some truly profound moral crises. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, the Catholic immigrant surge. Number 2, Americanizing the church. Number 3, the trauma of enslavement. And number 4, Christian abolitionists take action. All right, starting with section 1, the Catholic immigrant surge. Now, what's really interesting about this is the dual threat the Roman Catholic Church was fighting simultaneously. In the first half of the 19th century, you have this absolutely unprecedented volume of Catholic immigrants arriving in what was a largely Protestant America. Instantly, the church is hit from both sides. Internally, they're dealing with what's called the trusteeship problem. Basically, parishes were spreading out so rapidly across the colonies, out west, down south, that it created this severe shortage of priests. So, everyday lay people had to step up as trustees. And because they were totally imbued with these new American democratic ideals, they demanded the power to actually hire and fire their own priests, which, as you can imagine, clashed directly with traditional church hierarchy. But then externally, the threat was even worse, just rampant, severe anti-Catholic bigotry. And this external pushback, it quickly took political form. In 1837, the Native American Party was formed, and their specific purpose was to oppose Catholic immigration. But get this, they operated almost like a secret society. The press actually dubbed them the Know-Nothings, because anytime members were questioned by outsiders about their anti-immigrant policies, they were literally instructed to just reply, "I don't know anything." It's wild. And their ultimate political goal? They wanted to force Catholic immigrants to wait 21 long years before they could even apply for citizenship. The whole idea was just to discourage them from coming to America in the first place. So, facing all this intense hostility, the Catholic Church realized, hey, we have to take care of our own. They launched this 3-step institutional strategy to basically build a safe ecosystem and keep their immigrants' loyalty. Step 1 was establishing parochial schools. That was to shield Catholic children from the daily anti-Catholic pressure they'd face in public life. Step 2, building a massive network of charitable institutions. We're talking hospitals, elder care, orphanages, spaces where Catholics could actually feel secure. And step 3 was launching a dedicated Catholic press. Actually, a Boston newspaper called The Pilot proudly urged its readers to get the Catholic perspective. And incredibly enough, it is literally still in print today. Moving right along to section 2, Americanizing the Catholic Church. So as we enter the second half of the 19th century, the church has all this massive infrastructure in place, but now they face a brand new question. How do we actually fit into broader American culture without losing our faith? Two towering figures emerged to navigate this. Here in the U.S., you had Cardinal James Gibbons of Baltimore. He worked tirelessly to ease tensions. He openly supported the separation of church and state, which was huge because it assured Protestants that the Catholic Church wasn't trying to take over the government. Plus, he famously fought for the working class in the crowded tenements of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Meanwhile, over in Rome, Pope Leo XIII actually shared Gibbons' support for the working class. He released a famous document on it called Rerum Novarum. But the Pope was also super nervous. He actually wrote a document expressing his fear that the church in America was becoming a little too American, and he worried they might break away from strict papal authority. Well, despite Rome's nervousness, the Americanization process was pretty much unstoppable at that point. It culminated in two really major milestones. First, in 1908, the American Roman Catholic Church was officially taken off missionary status by Rome. That proved they were completely self-sustaining. And then shortly after, during the sheer devastation of World War I, American Catholics served courageously right alongside their Protestant and Jewish neighbors. So by the mid-20th century, the Catholic Church wasn't just surviving here, it had become a foundational, totally established pillar of American life. Okay, section 3, the trauma of enslavement. We're going to pivot now to the second major battle of the 19th century church, and I do want to prepare you for a pretty harsh tonal shift here. We are moving from institutional growth to the profound moral crisis of the transatlantic slave trade. Because to truly understand the abolitionist movement, we absolutely have to understand the brutal reality they were fighting against. The historian Stanley Elkins described enslavement not just as a condition, but as a series of devastating, stupefying psychological and physical shocks. And the first shock was simply the shock of capture. Huge numbers of people were taken in sudden surprise attacks right in their own African villages. Literally no one was safe. They were ripped from their daily lives, tied together by their necks, and forced into this grueling march to the sea under a glaring sun. And the heartbreaking part is, for those who survived that forced march, the nightmare was really just beginning. The next shock was the utter dread of the Middle Passage. Captive men and women were branded, assigned numbers on leaden tags, and then essentially herded into the bellies of these ships. The holds of these ships, packed tight with suffocating humanity, they became what's been described as stinking infernos of filth and pestilence. And that was for an agonizing 2-month voyage all the way across the Atlantic. So the crucial point here, and the numbers are just staggering, is the mortality rate. Of the estimated 15 million individuals taken, a full 1/3 died just on the march and at the trading stations. Then another third died during the horrors of the Middle Passage and the seasoning process over in the West Indies. That means the individuals who finally entered the American system of enslavement were the 1 in 3 who had already survived a journey of just unimaginable torment and profound trauma. Which brings us to Section 4, Christian abolitionists take action. Facing this sheer magnitude of institutionalized evil, you have to ask, how did society respond? Well, the fight actually began across the Atlantic with William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a wealthy Christian and a member of the British Parliament, and he was completely incensed and deeply grieved by the realities of the slave trade. So he decides to dedicate his entire life to ending slavery in the British Empire. In 1787, he founds the Abolition Committee. But he was facing a monumental uphill battle, right? He had to convince a public whose entire economy heavily depended on this brutal trade. And this brilliantly illustrates his whole strategy. Wilberforce was a total master of what we'd call today pressure politics. He knew he couldn't just argue with wealthy elites. Instead, he would invite them on these lovely, catered riverboat rides down the Thames. Sounds nice, right? But once they were out on the water, his crew would purposely steer their boats right alongside the slave ships that had just arrived from West Africa. He literally forced these elites to breathe in the overwhelming stench of those ships. He'd look at them and tell them, that is the smell of death, and you are responsible. He paired that visceral, sensory shock with massive public petitions demanding that Parliament end the trade. Now, Wilberforce didn't do this alone. He had some very powerful allies. In 1791, on his very deathbed, the famous cleric John Wesley penned the final letter of his life, and he sent it directly to William Wilberforce. Wesley encouraged him to keep up the relentless pressure against what he called that villainy of villainies. And thanks to this sustained Christian pressure, Britain did finally abolish the slave trade in 1807. Wilberforce actually lived just long enough to see slavery abolished in the entire British Empire in 1833. Let's move to the US and see how this builds on our shores, because this resistance started early here too. Back in 1775, the Quakers formed the world's very first anti-slavery society over in Philadelphia, mostly to urge their own fellow Quakers to give up slaveholding. Then, by 1784, the Methodist Christmas Conference drew a super hard line. They basically said, you simply cannot be a Methodist if you own slaves. But look, as the movement grew, it definitely faced immense complexities and some major missteps, particularly with a specific group that was founded in 1817. That 1817 group was the American Colonization Society. Their grand plan was to raise money, purchase slaves from their owners to free them, and then send them back to Africa. At the time, it was heavily supported by a lot of churches, but functionally, it was a massive failure for a few crucial reasons. First off, it completely ignored the root institutional evil of slavery itself. Second, a lot of its supporters secretly harbored beliefs of Black inferiority. Third, by sending freed individuals away, it was actively stripping America of potential Black leadership. In the end, out of millions of enslaved people, they only managed to free roughly 4,000 individuals. It was a severely flawed transitional movement. But people learned, and the movement evolved. By 1835, we had a massive institutional milestone. Charles Finney helped found Oberlin College in Ohio. Now, this was not just a regular school. It was established with the explicit primary mission of being an abolitionist institution. Plus, it was the first coeducational college in the entire country. It's a prime example of Christians using higher education as a direct tool to actively oppose systemic evil, really paving the way for the massive cultural shifts that would eventually tear the whole institution of slavery down. Which brings us to a final thought for today. The 19th century forced American Christians to grapple with some of the most immense social changes imaginable. They were engaged in two totally defining battles, one for the survival and integration of immigrants, and another for the total abolition of a horrific moral evil. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder. When we face monumental social shifts or institutional evils today, are our modern institutions simply fighting for their own self-preservation, or are they boldly fighting for justice? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.